Yeah, so double consciousness theory is a theory by W.E.B. Du Bois. Some scholars have actually deemed him as the father of critical race theory, so like the grandfather. Du Bois actually formed his theory based off of his own experiences as an African American in this country and his observations of other African Americans. That theory suggests that he says that because of the color line or because of racism, Black folk have to see themselves through two different modes of consciousness through their own eyes, how they see themselves, but they also have to know how white folks or white America see them. And so you're operating in the world with this double consciousness. So, how I would explain that is some people will say it's code switching, but it's not. Code switching, at least for me, is a byproduct of double consciousness. It is an act that one uses to negotiate the color line. But it's like you are aware of what's going on in the world, but you also have to be super aware of how the world sees you, even when they don't say anything.
I'm curious. So like as a kind of a follow-up question to dive deeper, how does double consciousness kind of relate to cultural capital and community cultural wealth?
Cultural capital is capital that only a select few can obtain. It is the information, the codes, or the objects one acquires or inherits that they can use to climb the ladder of social mobility. It is also access. So, for instance, like a second or third generation college student might have more access to codes and meanings and cognitive maps and how to negotiate just applying to go to college. Whereas if you look at a first generation college student, they probably won't have that information because one, their parents didn't go to college, their grandparents didn't go to college. And so the question becomes, well, they go to college, they applied, and they did all of these things. How were they able to do that? Because cultural capital, suggested by Bourdieu, suggests that only white European descendants from middle to upper class majority have access to cultural capital. So individuals who are not members of that group, Terioso suggests that those individuals, people of color, obtain cultural capital in a number of ways, but also they have their own culture. I echo her, is that people of color, we have our culture. The problem is that the dominant space sees what we bring to the table as deficient. For instance, so I had a student who could play his butt off. He was a guitarist. He actually won a Stella Award. He could play anything. And when I say anything, I mean anything. He was raised in the Black Baptist church. And in the Black Baptist church, it's not just about reading music. It's more so about your ears.
Right.
It's about responding to modulations, key changes, all these things at the drop of a hat. Well, here's the thing. This student didn't read music. And so, but a lot of Black kids were raised in the Black church. That was their music education, right? But here you have a student, like I mentioned, who played the guitar, who could hear anything and play it back. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to major in music. He actually wanted to go to UNT. The problem with that is that in order to get into any institution in this country, you got to be able to read music. And majority of kiddos who apply to these schools are not only white students, but they have that cultural capital. And the cultural capital in this case is being able to read notation, westernized notation. And so I think going back to the double consciousness piece, these, I believe, racist structures through the use of using certain pieces of information as a means to keep people out and to welcome people in is a form of racism. Mm-hmm. And so when a person like myself or the young man who I was talking about, the guitarist, we come up to apply, it's like not only do we see ourselves, our own culture, but we also see how the world sees our culture and minimizes it. But I believe that because we live in this very racist society, in this country that was actually built off of the notion of race, we grew up in it. And so we recognize that we've learned to see both sides of the world in order to survive. I think it was Andrew Hacker. He was an economist. He was actually talking about how parents have to have a conversation with their kids. And that's been recent in the news to talk about racism, to talk about how the world is going to see you. Even though if you work hard, you can be the president of the United States. And the many people, many occupants in the world or social agents in the world are going to see you as deficient. And there's this quote that he says, it says, there will be the perplexing and equally painful task of having to explain to your children why they will not be treated as other Americans, that they will never be altogether accepted, that they will always be regarded warily, if not with suspicion or hostility. When they ask whether this happens because of anything you have done, you must find ways of conveying that no, it is not because of any fault of their own. Further, for reasons you can barely explain yourself, you must tell them that much of the world has decided that you are not and cannot be their equals, that this world wishes to keep you apart, a caste that will neither absorb nor assimilate. You will tell your children this world is wrong, but because that world is there, they will have to struggle to survive with the scales weighted against them. They will have to work harder and do better, yet the results may be less recognition and reward. We all know that can be unfair. For Black people, this knowledge is not an academic theory, but a fact of daily life. I would go on record and say, if not all, most Black American kids have been told early on, here's this thing that's going to happen. You're not going to know why. It's going to be really weird and it's going to hurt, but just know it's not going to be your fault. And I think Black folks in America, we learn to negotiate this thing called double consciousness, or we anticipate it. We just don't know when it's going to happen. And it happens every day, the 1,000 daily cuts of it. And so if I was talking to somebody outside of music about this sort of work, double consciousness exists according to Du Bois and even according to myself. It exists because racism exists.
Right.
The color line exists, and until we address that, this experience, this two-ness that we experience will continue on. And it's not just Black folk, it's all people of color experience this in a number of ways.
Double consciousness is not something that I, as a white individual, was even aware of. And the only similar experience that I can think of is the last 10 years I've lived in a neighborhood, a part of town that is predominantly Latinx. And when I go grocery shopping or hang out with my neighbors or whatever, that is the only time that I'm aware of anything that sounds like double consciousness. And up until that point, it wasn't something that I thought about. It's one of those things where it's I want to learn more about this because I find problems with this. And so I'm wondering, what advice would you give for other educators who are trying to learn more about stuff like double consciousness, or just trying to understand that there are forms of violence and oppression kind of built into education, and how can educators then problematize that and then seek to change that?
I just had a conversation. I hosted this talk on what are the next steps towards realizing equality and justice for all, particularly for the white students and my white colleagues here at Illinois in the School of Music. And one of the things that is the most accessible way of addressing what you just said is having conversations with people.
Right.
It seems simple because it is simple. I tell students all the time, when you come into class, you guys always act like you're down for the cause and Black Lives Matter, but even in class, you won't even sit by someone else you've never sat by before. My thing is challenge your comfort level, have conversations with folks in your community. Where you live, I'm sure you have conversations with people who either A, don't look like you, B, probably have a different story or have a different reality. I think it is in those moments, in those opportunities where people can get to know what the reality is for their fellow neighbor.
Right.
It's really simple. And what's really funny is when I say that to people, they're like, well, what else we need to do? I'm like, that's what you need to do, silly man. And I think people are afraid to do that because in this country, our culture is very much like you have to have your own space. You stay over there, I stay over here. But if you go to Europe, even on the train, random people will sit next to you because they need that seat. They're not going to stand up and say, oh, I don't want to sit next to that person because that's a white person or that's a person who's Muslim. No, it's because I'm going to sit here because this seat is open. But here in this country, you can walk into a Starbucks and there are so many open chairs. But if there's one person at that table, no one's going to sit there.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that like ridiculous? But I think it's about really and truly, if you're in a grocery store, I do this all the time. If somebody's in front of me, I'll actually talk to them. I ask questions. It's kind of hard to do that in the Midwest because the Midwest is a little different.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 43, which is titled The Shire as Metaphor for Systemic Racism with Joyce McCall. You can listen to the full episode as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app or by going to jaredoleary.com.